Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People Story. How do you make an entire HOA board apologize in writing and pay for their own mistakes? When my HOA damaged my property and put up illegal signs, I didn't yell or argue. I used my professional skills to document everything, and the formal demand I sent them is a masterclass in getting exactly what you want. I work as a civil engineer. I have spent the better part of 15 years measuring things, reading surveys, studying site plans, and making sure that whatever gets built ends up exactly where it is supposed to be, and not 1 inch off. I say this not to brag, but because it is relevant to what happened, and it explains why the whole situation played out the way it did. When you spend your career obsessing over boundary lines and legal descriptions and property plats, you tend to be a little more careful than the average person when buying a house. You also tend to have better files. 3 years ago, my wife and I bought our current place. It is a corner lot, which I had specifically been hunting for, partly because I like the extra space and partly because the side yard access is more practical for a family that hosts people regularly. What really sold me, though, was something most buyers would not have thought twice about. Right next to our driveway, along the front corner of the property, there was a roughly 10-foot wide strip of land that the previous owners had finished with reinforced turf pavers. These are the interlocking grid-style pavers that grass grows up through, so they look almost like lawn from a distance but are sturdy enough to drive and park on without any issue. The previous owners had clearly installed them so they could park a third vehicle there without paving over more of the yard. Before we made an offer, I pulled the official survey plat from the county and confirmed exactly where the property lines ran. I did this in person at the county records office, which my wife found slightly embarrassing because she thought I was being that guy. But I wanted to know. That strip was entirely within our lot. It was not city right-of-way. It was not a public easement. It was not a shared access arrangement of any kind. The lot boundary ran well past it on all sides. It was ours, completely and unambiguously. My wife had asked me during house hunting why I was so fixated on a patch of grass-looking parking. I told her that with a corner lot in a neighborhood where street parking gets genuinely competitive on weekends and holidays, a private overflow spot for guests was worth real money compared to homes with identical square footage on interior lots. She thought I was being overly analytical. She was right about that. She was also wrong about whether it would matter. The neighborhood had a homeowners association, which I knew going in and was fine with in principle. For the first couple of years, it was genuinely reasonable. Dues were moderate, they kept the shared green spaces tidy, and nobody bothered us about anything. The board at the time was a low-key group that mostly just approved maintenance contracts and had mild disagreements about whether the seasonal flowers in the entrance beds should be yellow or purple. Then last fall, they held board elections. A new group came in, and while the president and treasurer were mostly fine, the new board had considerably more energy about enforcing aesthetic standards than the previous one. The part of this that ended up affecting me directly was the creation of something called the Neighborhood Aesthetics Committee, which was put under the leadership of a woman who lived about 4 houses down. I will just refer to her as the committee chair. The committee chair is the kind of person who walks her small dog around the block multiple times a day. And at each pass, she is looking at everything. Your yard, your driveway, the condition of your fence, how your trash cans are positioned after pickup day. It is not casual observation, it is assessment. She had already approached 2 other neighbors before she got around to me, once about a basketball hoop being too close to the street, and once about someone's garden edging allegedly being uneven. Both times she had framed it as helpful feedback from a concerned neighbor rather than a formal complaint. But everyone on the street knew what it was. My first direct interaction with her happened about 3 weeks before things escalated. I was coming back from getting my mail at the end of a workday, and she came walking past with the dog, and she slowed down in a way that made clear she had something to say. She looked over at the paver strip and made a comment about how the curb would read cleaner without vehicles parked there, that it disrupted the visual flow of the corner. I told her it was a guest spot and one of the specific reasons we had bought this lot. She made a small sound, something non-committal, and kept walking with the dog. I did not think much of it in the moment. I went back inside and forgot about it. I should not have forgotten about it. 4 weeks later, I was driving home from work on a Friday. It had been a long week, one of those weeks where you are already halfway mentally checked out before you even get in the car, and all you want is to walk in your front door and stop thinking about anything work-related for 48 hours. I turned onto our street and immediately knew something was wrong even before I could make out the details. From the middle of the block, I could see that the corner looked different. By the time I got close enough to understand what I was seeing, I had to actually stop the car for a moment. The entire length of the paver strip had been painted bright red along its border, not on the public street curb, on the actual edge material of my private landscaping, and 2 metal signs had been installed on poles at either end of the strip. These were not cheap, flimsy things on wire stakes. They were on proper metal posts, the kind that look official and permanent, mounted with real hardware. The signs read as a no parking zone by order of the HOA, with a warning that violators would be towed at the vehicle owner's expense. I pulled slowly into the driveway and walked over to look more carefully. That is when I noticed the detail that pushed everything past the point of a neighborly annoyance and into something else entirely. The metal poles were not set in the ground beside the pavers. They had been bolted directly into the paver grid itself. The fasteners had been driven through the surface material, and around 2 of the bolt holes I could see the pavers had cracked, the damage radiating outward in small fracture lines from each point of penetration. I stood there looking at it for maybe 30 seconds. My wife came out because she had heard the car and could tell by my posture that something was off. When she saw what had happened, she wanted to walk straight over to the committee chair's house right then. I told her not to, and I meant it. Not because I was trying to be the bigger person in some abstract way, but because going over there in that moment would accomplish nothing useful and might actually make things harder later. I was not going to have a shouting match in a driveway that I would then have to walk back from. What I felt, standing there looking at the signs and the cracked pavers and the red paint on my private land, was not quite anger. It was something more like focus. They had physically trespassed on my property, drilled into and cracked my pavers, applied paint to my landscape border, and put up enforcement signage that purported to restrict my use of my own land. Every one of those things was a problem for them, not for me. The only question was how thoroughly I was going to document it before I responded. I went inside, got a glass of water, and went to my home office. I opened the filing cabinet and pulled out the folder I keep for house documents. The deed was in there, the title, insurance paperwork, the closing disclosures, and the official survey plat that I had pulled from the county before we ever made an offer on this place. I set the folder on the desk. Then I picked up my phone and went back outside. Documentation came first, and I took my time with it. My wife watched me from the front step for a few minutes and then went back inside because she knew once I get into this mode, she is better off leaving me to it. I use a photo app that embeds timestamp and GPS coordinate data into every image, something I set up for fieldwork and had never turned off on my personal phone. In my job, if you cannot show when and where something was observed, you might as well not have observed it at all. I had a feeling that same standard was going to matter here, so I made sure everything was on and capturing correctly before I started. I started with wide shots from across the street, capturing the full corner in context and showing how the signs and painted border related to the house and driveway. Then I worked closer, taking mid-range shots that established the relationship between the signposts and my property line and my driveway edge. Then I got up close to the signs themselves, capturing every word on them clearly. Then I crouched down and photographed the bolts where they went into the pavers, making sure to capture both the hardware and the cracking damage that spread out from each hole. I took specific shots of the red paint on the landscape border to document that it was on my private edging material and not on any public curb surface. After the photos, I went back inside and got my 30-foot tape measure. I also brought out the survey plat. I propped my phone against the base of the mailbox post to record a video, then walked through a measurement. The iron survey pin that marks the corner of the lot is exactly where the county plat shows it, and it is not hard to find if you have ever looked for one before. I narrated what I was doing for the camera, measured from the pin inward along the front property line, and established clearly on video that the nearest signpost was sitting 5.5 feet inside my property boundary. Not a close call, not something that could be chalked up to a minor surveying ambiguity. 5.5 feet into private deeded land. With all of that saved and backed up to 2 different places, I went back inside and spent about an hour going through the HOA covenants and bylaws which I had kept since closing. I was not looking for something vague to argue about. I was looking for something specific, the provision that the board thought authorized them to go on to an individually owned lot and install physical structures without the owner's knowledge or consent. There was nothing. I read through the whole document twice, slowly. The covenants covered what homeowners could and could not do with their own properties in terms of fences, exterior finishes, additions, and landscaping standards. They addressed the common areas and the association's responsibilities there. They referenced the city's own ordinances for public street parking. What they did not contain, anywhere in the document, was language giving the board or any committee the authority to enter a homeowner's deeded private property, install signage, apply paint, or physically alter anything on that land. I sat back and thought clearly about where things stood. I had time-stamped, GPS-tagged photographs documenting what had been done and when. I had video proof that the sign sat more than 5 feet inside my property line. I had the county-recorded survey confirming I owned the land, and I had a complete absence in the governing documents of any authority for what had been done to it. I have reviewed a lot of legal and engineering documents in my career. One thing you learn quickly is that the absence of something in a governing document is just as significant as the presence of something. The covenants did not have a gap or an ambiguous clause that might charitably be read to allow what they had done. There was simply nothing there. The board had apparently decided they had a power that did not exist anywhere in writing, and had then acted on it on my property, and had cracked my pavers in the process. I opened my laptop and started writing. The message I sent that evening went to the full board and was copied to the property management company that handles the association's administrative functions. I kept the tone entirely factual and professional because a calm, documented inquiry was going to be much harder to dismiss than an angry one, and I wanted them to have to actually respond to the substance of what I was asking. I described what I had come home to find. I referenced the official survey plat and explained that the paver strip was private property, part of my deeded lot, not a public right-of-way or city easement. I attached the time-stamped photos and a copy of the relevant survey section with the property line indicated. Then I asked 3 questions. First, could the board point me to the specific provision in the HOA covenants that authorized them to install structures or apply paint on a homeowner's private deeded property? Second, could they provide the minutes from the board meeting where the vote to approve this work and authorize expenditure of HOA funds for it had taken place? Third, could they give me the contractor's contact information because that contractor had cracked 2 of my pavers and I needed to address the damage with them directly? That was it. I sent it and went to bed. The next morning I had a response. It did not come from the board president, and it did not come from the property management contact. It came from the committee chair's personal email address. She did not answer any of my 3 questions. What she wrote instead was that the aesthetics committee had determined the parking spot was unsightly and posed a potential safety issue for vehicles navigating the corner. She said the board had the authority to maintain community standards. She said the matter was considered closed. I read it twice. Then I opened a dedicated folder on my desktop, labeled it for this situation, and saved the email into it. Because what she had just put in writing was a confirmation that the HOA had deliberately and intentionally placed those signs on my property. She had not said it was a mistake. She had not suggested there was any confusion about where the property line was. She had not offered any documentation, any covenant citation, any meeting record, or any basis in law or policy at all. She had explained the reasoning behind a deliberate decision, which meant she was acknowledging that a deliberate decision had been made. She had cited 0 legal basis for that decision because she had none to cite. What struck me sitting there reading her email was how confident she was. The tone was one of someone who was used to telling people things and having them comply, someone who had probably sent variations of this message to a dozen other neighbors and watched them back down. That was the problem she had not accounted for. I was not going to back down, and I was not going to get emotional about it. I was going to document it and then bury her in paperwork. I forwarded her email to my personal backup address, printed a physical copy, and added it to my folder alongside the survey and the photos. Then I called my wife in. She read through the response and asked me if this was as good as it seemed. I told her it was better than I had realistically hoped for, and that I was going to spend the next day putting together a follow-up that she was probably going to enjoy. What I drafted over the next day was not a casual inquiry or another round of questions. I formatted it as a formal written demand and prepared 2 copies. One I sent by email that evening to create a time-stamped digital record. The second I took to the post office the following morning and sent by certified mail with return receipt requested, addressed to the board president and the property management company. I wanted there to be no possible argument later that they had not received it. The document walked through the full timeline factually and in sequence. It cited the committee chair's written response by date and described it precisely for what it was: a written confirmation from an HOA representative that the installation had been carried out intentionally, with no claim of legal basis offered. It stated that the placement of structures on private property without the owner's consent constituted trespass under state law, and that the resulting damage to my pavers constituted destruction of private property. It noted clearly that the HOA covenants contain no provision authorizing the board or any committee to take this kind of action on homeowner-owned land. Then came the demands, numbered and specific. First, within 48 hours, the HOA was required to remove the signs, poles, and all associated hardware entirely at the association's expense. Second, within 7 days, the HOA was required to retain a licensed contractor to repair the cracked pavers to their original condition and remove all paint from the landscape border with my written approval of the repair plan required before work could begin. Third, the board president was required to provide a written acknowledgement that the association had acted without authority and a formal commitment that no similar action would be taken against my property in the future. The section outlining the consequences was where I was most deliberate. I wrote that failure to comply with any of these deadlines would result in my filing a police report documenting trespass and property damage. I wrote that I would retain an attorney and file a civil suit against the association seeking compensation for repair costs, legal fees, and punitive damages. And I wrote that I would compile the complete written record of this situation, including the committee chair's own email confirming that the action was intentional, and distribute it by mail to every homeowner in the community so that they could understand precisely how their dues had been used and what legal exposure the board's decision had created on their behalf. That last point was not posturing. I had the full homeowner roster because it had come in the closing documents. Every address, right there. I was completely prepared to do exactly what I said. I want to be honest about the mindset I was in writing that document. I was not hoping they would refuse so I could escalate. Escalation costs time and money and stress, and none of that sounded appealing. What I wanted was for them to read it, understand exactly how exposed they were, and do the right thing. But I was also ready to follow through on every single word if they did not, and I think that came through in the way the letter was written. There is a difference between a threat someone writes when they are angry and one someone writes after spending a day reviewing their evidence and the law. I think most people can tell the difference when they read it. I sent the email version that evening. I dropped the certified mail envelope at the post office the next morning. Then I went home, made dinner with my wife, and waited to see how this was going to go. The certified letter was delivered on a Tuesday morning. I know this because the return receipt came back to me 2 days later with a signature on it time-stamped at 10:14 a.m. By early afternoon of that same Tuesday, my phone rang. It was the board president. I want to describe the energy of that call accurately because it was genuinely remarkable. The version of the board president I had encountered at neighborhood meetings was composed and a little self-important. The kind of person who enjoys running things and wants you to know he is running them. The person on the phone Tuesday afternoon was not that person. He was talking quickly, and there was an edge in his voice that I recognized as someone who had just spent several hours realizing how badly things had gone sideways on his watch. He said there had been a terrible misunderstanding. He said the committee chair had acted without proper board authorization, that he personally had not been fully briefed on the details of what she was planning to do, and certainly had not approved drilling into a homeowner's private property. He used the phrase overstepped her authority several times. He apologized not in the vague way people apologize when they want a situation to go away, but in the specific, almost frantic way people apologize when they have just read a document that clearly outlines what a lawsuit against them would look like. I let him finish. When he was done, I told him I appreciated the call and that it was good we were on the same page about what had happened. Then I told him calmly that I needed everything laid out in the written demand to be completed in full within the stated time frames before I would consider the matter resolved. There was a brief pause. Then he said they would take care of everything. I thanked him and got off the phone. My wife was standing in the doorway of my office and had heard enough of the one-sided conversation to understand the general direction it had gone. She asked me how he had sounded. I told her he sounded like a man who had just discovered that one of his committee chairs had walked him off the edge of a cliff and he was still in the process of falling. The next morning, a work crew showed up at my house. I want to be specific about the difference between this crew and whoever had installed the signs in the first place, because the contrast was telling. The installation crew, whoever they were, had apparently not been particularly careful. They had bolted poles into paver material without any apparent consideration for what that would do to the surface, and they had painted a border without what looked like any protective measures for the adjacent material. The removal crew was a different situation entirely. These were professionals from a proper landscaping and site work company. The lead guy came to the door first and introduced himself, told me what they were planning to do, and asked me to walk the area with him so he could show me their approach before they started. They had the right tools for extracting the hardware without causing additional cracking. They worked methodically. They filled the bolt holes cleanly and packed the surrounding material before removing the poles, so the grid units that were still intact stayed that way. By late morning, the signs were gone, the posts were gone, all the hardware was in their truck, and the surface looked considerably better than I had expected given the damage. My wife brought them water while they were working. She told me later she was being friendly but also wanted to get a sense of whether they knew what had happened. She said the lead guy had been pretty tight-lipped but did mention at one point that the HOA had called them first thing that morning and that it had been a pretty urgent call. 2 days after the sign removal, a different crew came for the pavers and the paint. The paver repair required sourcing matching material, which the contractor had apparently done the previous day because they arrived with the right units already in the truck. The 2 cracked pavers were extracted and replaced, and whoever had done the sourcing work had matched the color and texture well enough that you genuinely cannot tell, looking at it now, that anything was ever replaced. The red paint on the landscape border came off with a combination of chemical treatment and careful mechanical removal, and they did not damage the underlying material in the process. The whole job took most of a day. I walked the finished area that evening after they left. I had the original photos on my phone and I compared them to what I was looking at. The paver strip looked, if anything, slightly better than it had before all of this started, because the replacement units sat a little more evenly than the older ones around them. My wife stood next to me looking at it and said something like, "Well, they did a decent job cleaning up their own mess." I told her that was the minimum we were owed and that we were not done yet. The written acknowledgement arrived about a week after the repair work was finished. It came as a formal letter printed on HOA stationery, and it was signed by every member of the board, not just the president, every single one of them. The letter acknowledged that the no parking installation had been carried out on private property without authorization. It acknowledged that no provision in the HOA covenants granted the board or any of its committees the authority to install structures or apply modifications to a homeowner's individually deeded land. It acknowledged that the physical damage to my pavers had been caused by the association's contractor. It apologized for all of it and committed explicitly in writing that the HOA would not take any similar action against my property or any other homeowner's private land in the future. My wife read through it at the kitchen table and then looked up and said she really did want to frame it. I told her we could put it in the file instead, which is where it is now, sitting behind the survey plat and the original deed in the same cabinet where I keep everything else related to this house. If the board ever develops amnesia about what happened, I have the original document ready to refresh their memory. The quarterly HOA meeting fell about 3 weeks after the repair work was complete. I do not typically attend these meetings. The format is usually a brief financial update, some discussion of minor maintenance issues, and a lot of time spent on things that do not particularly affect me. But I went to this one. I found a seat toward the back and had my coffee. There were maybe 30 homeowners in attendance, which is a decent turnout for a quarterly meeting. The board president ran through the agenda at a pace that suggested he wanted to get through everything as efficiently as possible. He covered the financials, the upcoming common area maintenance schedule, a brief update on a drainage issue near the back of the neighborhood. Then he got to committee reports. He mentioned that several committees had nothing new to report. When he got to the aesthetics committee, he paused just slightly before saying that the committee would be operating under a revised scope going forward with new oversight requirements, and that the previous chair had stepped down from her position effective immediately after the last meeting. He said it flatly, without editorial comment, and moved directly to the next item on the agenda. The committee chair was in the room, sitting near the front. She did not turn around during this announcement. She kept her posture very still and her eyes forward, and I imagine that took some effort. I did not go out of my way to look at her. I had not come to gloat or to make the moment harder for her than it already was. I had come because I live in this neighborhood, I pay my dues, and I have every right to attend the meeting where the board is publicly accounting for what happened. I drank my coffee and listened to the rest of the agenda. When the meeting ended, I said a few words to a couple of neighbors I recognized and then left. On the walk back to my house, I passed the front corner of my lot. The paver strip was sitting there in the afternoon light, clean and intact, the grass growing up through the grid the same way it always had. A few months have passed now, and the neighborhood has been noticeably quieter in the way that a place gets quiet after something with real consequences happens and people adjust their behavior accordingly. The aesthetics committee still exists, but I have not heard anything from it since. No comments, no notices, no one peering at anyone's driveway with a clipboard. The board has been professional and unobtrusive, which is exactly what an HOA board should be. The paver strip is back to what it has always been, which is a convenient guest spot for anyone coming to our house when the street is full. My wife's parents use it when they visit for holidays. My buddy parks there when we watch games. Nobody has ever been towed. Every now and then, someone newer to the neighborhood, a recent move-in who was not around when everything happened, will see a car parked there and ask me if that is allowed. I tell them it is private property and they are welcome to park as my guest any time. One of my neighbors who had watched the whole situation play out from start to finish caught up with me a couple of weeks after the meeting and told me he wished he had handled his basketball hoop situation the same way, instead of just taking the hoop down when the committee chair complained. I told him the difference was that his hoop had actually been on public sidewalk, which he conceded was fair. What I walked away from this whole thing understanding a little more clearly is that a lot of people with authority, real or assumed, are counting on the people beneath them not knowing their rights or not being willing to put in the time to document and enforce them. The committee chair had almost certainly sent plenty of demands to neighbors who just complied because it was easier than pushing back, and that track record probably made her confident that this one would be the same. She had not stopped to check whether the land she was proposing to regulate actually belonged to the association. She had not looked up the relevant sections of the covenants. She had not asked anyone whether what she was doing was legal. She had just decided she wanted the parking spot gone and moved forward. That works right up until it does not work. Then it stops working very quickly. My paver strip is the most thoroughly documented 10 feet of privately owned land in the entire county. The survey is current, the photos are archived, the demand letter and the board's signed acknowledgement are filed and ready. If anyone ever has questions about who owns that corner and what can be done with it, I have a very complete answer prepared. The HOA learned that if you are going to draw a line in the sand and put signs on it, you need to be absolutely certain that sand does not belong to the guy who measures things for a living. The next one is a malicious compliance story. In my first job, I worked in IT as an access and permissions administrator at a large company with significant technological debt. The environment included custom software dating back to the Windows 9X and even DOS era. Initially, the work was quite tedious, involving a lot of back and forth communication between multiple departments. We had to ensure that each employee had the necessary training and documentation to access data in the scope requested by their manager. Additionally, we needed approval from the manager of the department related to the system role in question. On top of that, the company's excessive paper-only bureaucratic workflow made the work go at a snail's pace. A single SAP account for a blue-collar worker required at least 3 forms signed by different people. The heads of departments responsible for signing those papers didn't feel any urgency to send them to us quickly. A good example of this is when I, myself, waited over 2 weeks after being hired in the IT department before my first account was set up. Until then, I only had a guest account that allowed me to access the main internal website with the company's procedures, regulations, and other basic information. Up to this point, each signed form had to be physically delivered to us, which was agonizingly slow given that the company had multiple branches. We decided to automate away the paperwork. Our first step was to allow the use of scanned documents. It was a partial success. While it eliminated the courier delays, management still required us to sign the physical copies afterward, which we mass stamped at the end of each month. The next step was to introduce a fully electronic workflow. We faced significant resistance from upper management, so we had to settle on a system that mostly replicated the existing paper processes. Despite this, it was a game changer. We created presets that managers could select and customize as needed, using data from these customizations to create better-fitting presets. We also developed workflows that automatically generated and assigned subtickets for necessary approvals and tracked how long it took, sending reminders if needed. And finally, we got an approval from HR to access layoff data to generate user block/removal tickets. Sometime after we rolled out the new system, the HR/payroll manager made a big fuss. She was furious that her team was still waiting weeks to get their permissions and questioned whether all our work had been for nothing. That really struck a chord with me. Inside, I was overjoyed, but I did my best to keep a neutral expression. At that time, we were working on summary reports with burn-down and bottleneck charts, and I already knew that tickets requesting HR/payroll access were spending over most of their lifespan waiting for her or one of her sub-managers to approve them. The manager immediately went on the defensive, claiming she couldn't keep up with the amount of tickets. She then requested a change. She wanted any request from her employee to be automatically approved within the relevant scope of their sub-department. For example, a request for an HR worker to have full HR access and limited payroll access would be automatically approved for HR access but not for payroll, and vice versa. I was skeptical but weren't exactly in a position to argue. I asked my boss to join the discussion and explained that the goal was to prevent overly permissive approvals that could lead to unauthorized access. I tried to convince her to brainstorm together potential edge cases before making a blanket approval, but she was already set on her decision and wasn't interested in discussing details. My boss shrugged and said it would be her responsibility. He told her to write up an official document outlining the change, and we would proceed with the implementation. The only request we had was to include a line that each such request would still be created, assigned to as normal and marked as automatically approved by name of the main HR payroll manager decision. I uploaded the scan into our system and, anticipating that it would eventually backfire, made a photocopy to keep it handy in the top drawer of my desk. The original copy went to the archive. A few weeks later, she stormed into our room. The speed with which she flung open the door made it clear she was furious. She demanded to know why we had granted full access to payroll data to her subordinate. I think it was the only time I ever heard anyone yell in the company. I calmly reminded her of her request to automatically approve in-department access requests. She wasn't having it, explaining that one of her low-ranking subordinates from the payroll sub-department had accessed the salaries of everyone in their department, including managers, and was unhappy with the paycheck disparity. Isn't that obvious that they shouldn't be able to do that? Well, yeah, to a human, but that decision was automated away by your request. I handed her a copy of the document she had signed, which instructed us to automatically approve any and all such tickets without exception. Immediately afterward, she asked us to roll back the change while she wrote up another document to cancel the previous one. In the following days, she meticulously reviewed all those tickets and requested us to reduce access for several users. I have to admit, she did a thorough job and kept up a good pace in reviewing new requests, doing it daily instead of once every week or two as before. In the end, we managed to distill a subset of permissions that could be approved automatically and proceeded to implement a similar approach with other departments. Anyway, thank you for watching.